March 14th, 1979. 6:22 a.m., Alexandria, Virginia. The street is still dark, not the dramatic dark of a moonless night, but the gray, indifferent dark of early spring in the American suburbs. The kind that smells like wet mulch and car exhaust and someone's coffee brewing 3 houses down. The temperature hovers at 34 degrees Fahrenheit. A thin crust of frost coats the windshields on Beauregard Street. Somewhere on the block, a sprinkler has malfunctioned overnight, and a thin sheet of ice now glazes the sidewalk in front of number 4411. The man who emerges from that house at precisely 6:22 a.m. does not slip. He steps carefully, methodically, the way a man steps who has been trained to be invisible in plain sight, who has spent years perfecting the art of being unremarkable. He wears a brown corduroy jacket, slightly worn at the elbows, over a cream-colored button-down shirt. He carries a brown leather briefcase. The briefcase is scuffed at the corners. And it has been scuffed deliberately, rubbed against a brick doorstep over many months until it achieved exactly the right degree of ordinary wear. Nothing about him announces itself. That is the point. His neighbors, if any of them had been watching, and none of them were, would have registered nothing unusual. He was, to them, the quiet man, the one who always waved from the driveway, who brought in the Hendersons' trash cans when they were out of town, who grew tomatoes in the summer and left paper bags of them on doorsteps without notes, whose name, according to the mailbox, according to the Neighborhood Association roster, according to the Alexandria gas and electric billing address, was Alexei Dmitrievich Petrov, known to everyone on the street simply as Alex. He drives a 1976 Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme, sand beige, with a small crack in the rear left taillight that he has never repaired. Well, he takes the same route to work every morning. Left on King Street, right on Seminary Road, left again onto I-3-95 North toward Washington. He works, according to his employer identification, as a trade attaché for the Soviet commercial mission at the embassy on Wisconsin Avenue. This is a plausible, boringly plausible, cover. There are 47 such trade attachés registered with the State Department. 12 of them are by sea. IA estimates made in a classified assessment dated February 1978 and filed under code word access only as document CYA-HQ-001978-R-4412, officers of the KGB's First Chief Directorate. What none of his neighbors know, what none of his colleagues at the commercial mission know, what even his wife Natalia has been told only in the most abstract terms, is that the scuffed briefcase he carries this particular morning contains, on flash paper, and 22 pages of on-flash paper, and 22 pages of hand-transcribed technical specifications for the United States Navy's AN/BQ Q-5 submarine sonar system. The specifications were passed to him 3 nights ago, in the parking garage beneath the Landmark Mall on Duke Street, by a man whose identity we will come to, and whose name, when it finally surfaces, not in 1979, not in 1980, but in 2001, in a courtroom in Alexandria, Virginia, less than 4 miles from this very street, will cause a scandal so profound that it will force the United States intelligence community to fundamentally redesign the way it identifies its own traitors. The frost catches the first light of morning. Petrov's Oldsmobile disappears around the corner. On the mailbox at 4411, the name reads Kozlov. It is not his real name, but it is the name he has used for 11 years. And for 11 years, it has been enough. The official story, the one that the Federal Bureau of Investigation maintained in its internal operational assessments through most of the 1970s, was straightforward in the way that comfortable fictions always are. The Soviet intelligence presence in the United States was large, acknowledged, and manageable. The KGB's residency at the Washington Embassy, known in intelligence parlance as the Residentura, but was staffed by known officers operating under known covers. The FBI's intelligence division maintained active surveillance portfolios on 31 identified KGB personnel in the Washington metropolitan area as of January 1st, 1979. Surveillance teams from the Washington field office rotated coverage. Drop sites and communication patterns were monitored. The system, in the Bureau's own assessment language, was substantially effective. This was not entirely a lie. It was something more dangerous than a lie. It was a truth that had been allowed to become smug. What the FBI's assessment did not account for, could not account for, given what it did not know, was the degree to which the KGB's Department S, the illegal intelligence arm, had successfully seeded the American interior with officers operating entirely outside the embassy structure. These were the illegals, men and women who did not appear on any diplomatic list, who carried no Soviet identity documents, who had spent years sometimes a decade or more in chores, building genuine American lives, accumulating genuine American social networks, and running intelligence operations that generated no diplomatic exposure whatsoever. If an embassy officer was caught, he was declared persona non grata and expelled. If an illegal was caught, he was arrested, tried, and imprisoned. The stakes were categorically higher. The operations, consequently, were of a different order of sophistication entirely. The man living at 4411 Beauregard Street under the name Alexei Kozlov. His true name was Yuri Alexandrovich Nasenko, a fact that will cause considerable confusion given that there was a famous KGB defector of that same last name who had come to the CIA in 1964. A confusion that may or may not have been engineered by Department S as a layer of operational obfuscation, had entered the United States in September 1968. He had entered through Montreal, traveling on a Canadian passport in the name of Brian Jeffrey Kozlov, the document constructed around the stolen identity of a real Canadian citizen, Brian Kozlov, who had died in an automobile accident in Winnipeg in 1962 at the age of 7, and whose birth certificate had therefore never generated a passport application, a social security record, or any other adult identity document. The technique was known within the KGB's operational tradecraft as tombstoning, harvesting the identities of the infant dead, and it was used with sufficient frequency throughout this period that a 1975 CIA counterintelligence assessment, classified secret/no foreign, and cataloged as CIH Q-CI-1975-00287, described it as the single most effective identity construction methodology in the Soviet illegals toolkit. Kozlov, we will use the name he used, the name his neighbors used, the name his children used, had built his American life with the patient, systematic thoroughness of a man who understood that his existence depended on the quality of his construction. He had enrolled in night classes at George Mason University in 1969, earning a degree in business administration in 1972. He had worked for 3 years as a purchasing manager for a commercial shipping firm in Arlington, generating a paper trail of payslips, performance reviews, and professional references that would withstand casual scrutiny. He had married Natalia Volkova, herself an officer of the KGB's line PR, tasked with political intelligence operations, in a ceremony at a small Baptist church in Falls Church, Virginia, in 1970. They had 2 children, a daughter, Elena, born 1971, and a son, Dmitry, born 1973. Both children spoke Russian only in the house, and only in whispers, as though the walls themselves might carry the language somewhere inconvenient. Though in 1974, Kozlov had accepted a position as a junior trade consultant with the Soviet commercial mission. This was a tactical concession. It brought him into the embassy structure in a limited way, which increased his visibility to FBI surveillance. But it also gave him legitimate access to embassy communications infrastructure, to the diplomatic pouch, and most critically, to the network of Soviet military intelligence officers, GRU, rather than KGB, who operated under commercial cover and who were his primary operational counterparts. The intelligence he was tasked to collect was not political. It was technical. Specifically, it was naval. This was the era of the undersea war. Beneath the surfaces of the Atlantic and Pacific, Soviet and American submarines were engaged in a continuous, silent campaign of intelligence gathering, strategic positioning, and technological one-upmanship that represented, in the view of both the U.S. Chief of Naval Operations and the Soviet Navy's Commander Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, the most consequential strategic competition of the Cold War. The ability to track enemy submarines, to locate them, classify them, and maintain targeting solutions on them was not a tactical capability. It was existential. In a nuclear exchange, the side that could kill the other's ballistic missile submarines in the opening hours would achieve a first strike advantage that made every other strategic consideration secondary. The Americans held the edge in acoustic detection technology. Specifically, the AN/BQQ-5 sonar suite, installed in the Los Angeles-class attack submarine beginning in 1976, represented a generational advance over anything the Soviet Navy could field. The system's ability to detect and classify Soviet submarines at ranges that exceeded Soviet detection capabilities by a factor that, according to a declassified 1991 Navy assessment, was operationally decisive, meaning the Americans could hear the Soviets before the Soviets knew they were being heard, was the single most important tactical intelligence advantage the United States Navy possessed. Moscow wanted the BQQ-5 specifications with an urgency that bordered on desperation, and they had placed Yuri Kozlov in exactly the right city, with exactly the right cover, to get them. The key player on the American side, the man whose career and whose tragedy anchors this story, was Special Agent Robert Hansen. Though in 1979, Hansen is not yet who he will become. In 1979, Hansen is 35 years old, a former Chicago Police Department officer who joined the FBI in 1972 and has been assigned to the New York Field Office's Soviet counterintelligence squad. And he is brilliant, arrogant, deeply devout in a specific flavor of conservative Catholicism that he has recently adopted with the fervor of a convert. And he is, according to colleagues who will speak about him in retrospect, with the particular discomfort of people who liked someone they should have suspected, intensely interested in how the other side operates. The other key player, the source who bridges the distance between what Kozlov needed and what Kozlov received, is a man whose name does not appear in the public record until the FBI's criminal complaint of February 2001. His name is Robert Philip Hansen. In 1979, he is both of these things simultaneously. The FBI counterintelligence officer assigned to monitor Soviet intelligence activities, and the most damaging spy in American history, who has just begun passing classified material to the GRU through a dead drop system of such elegant simplicity that it will take the FBI 22 years to find him. The connection between Hansen and Kozlov is not direct. The KGB's operational doctrine for the handling of highly sensitive American sources was explicit and inflexible. No face-to-face contact, no telephone communication, no meeting in which either party could identify the other. The system was a daisy chain of dead drops, as signal sites, and one-time pad communications designed so that the source and the handler never occupied the same space at the same time and could not, if captured, identify each other. Hansen knew only a post office box. Kozlov knew only the landmark mall parking garage and the particular signaling protocol, a piece of white chalk on a specific fire hydrant on Duke Street that indicated a package was waiting. Between them, in the space that neither could see, was the entire architecture of Soviet intelligence tradecraft, invisible, elegant, and for 2 decades, completely secure. What was really happening in the spring of 1979 was a convergence that neither Washington nor Moscow had fully grasped. 3 separate intelligence operations were running simultaneously in the same city, intersecting in ways that none of the responsible officers on any side had mapped. The CIA's counterintelligence staff, under the direction of the legendary, and by this point considerably diminished, James Angleton, who had been forced out as counterintelligence chief in 1974 following the Hirsch expose, but whose influence lingered in the institutional culture of the Directorate of Operations, had developed a source within the KGB's Washington residency. This source, identified in CIA cable traffic as GTFOXHUNT, all KGB penetration assets were prefixed GT in the CIA's numbering system, and had been providing fragmentary but consistent reporting since early 1978, suggesting that a highly productive illegal network was operating in the Northern Virginia area. GTF Foxhunt's reporting was frustrating in its specificity about outputs and vagueness about sources. The source could report that Moscow Center was receiving high-grade technical intelligence on U.S. naval systems. The BQQ-5 was mentioned by designation in a signals intelligence intercept processed by NSA and logged as SIGINT-NSA-1979-0219-C, but could not report the identity of the collector. This was not laziness or incompetence. It was the system working exactly as designed. The illegal's identity was known, within Moscow Center itself, to no more than 4 or 5 officers. The KGB's own compartmentalization protected its assets from its own potential defectors. The CIA's response to GTFOXHUNT's reporting was a program designated Operation Penrose, authorized under a classified finding dated October 3, 1978, and tasked to the Washington Station's counterintelligence branch. Penrose's objective was to identify the illegal or illegals responsible for the naval intelligence collection. Its methods included the analysis of travel patterns of known Soviet personnel, the review of counterintelligence referrals from the naval intelligence community, and, in a decision that will prove, in retrospect, to be one of the most consequential administrative choices in the history of American espionage, the cross-referencing of FBI surveillance logs with CIA asset protection protocols to ensure that known CIA sources were not inadvertently being placed under FBI coverage. That cross-referencing produced, on the desk of a CIA officer named Margaret Sherwood on the morning of April 9, 1979, a single anomaly. An FBI surveillance log from March 14th, the same morning we began with the Frost, the Oldsmobile, the scuffed briefcase, noted a vehicle, sand beige Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme, Virginia plate P JK441, parked in the Landmark Mall parking garage from 11:47 p.m. to 12:03 a.m. on March 13th to 14th. The log noted it because an FBI surveillance team had been conducting an unrelated physical surveillance of a Soviet embassy officer in the same parking structure that evening. The vehicle had been photographed, and the plates had been run. The registered owner was listed as Alexei Kozlov, 4411 Beauregard Street, Alexandria, employed at the Soviet commercial mission. Sherwood read this and set it aside. A Soviet commercial mission employee in a parking garage at midnight was not, by itself, remarkable. She filed the log cross-reference in the Penrose working file and moved on to other matters. The briefcase, with its aluminum false panel and its Minix camera and its 22 pages of BQQ-5 specifications, had already left Virginia. It had gone out in the diplomatic pouch 4 days earlier. The specifications were in Moscow Center before Margaret Sherwood ever read the surveillance log. The chess game had produced a check that neither player had seen, and the clock was already running on the next move. In the autumn of 1979, the Soviet Navy made a decision. It was not a dramatic decision, not the kind that gets announced at a Politburo meeting or noted in a first secretary's diary. It was a technical decision made at the level of the Navy's Scientific Technical Directorate, in a department whose budget did not appear in any document accessible to Western intelligence. The decision was this: to begin modifying the propeller shaft, bearing design on the Victor III class attack submarines in a way that reduced the vessel's acoustic signature at low speeds. The modification was modest. The reduction in detectable noise was, according to a 1985 classified DYA assessment, cataloged as DIA-1985-M-00441, approximately 6 decibels at speeds below 8 knots. In absolute terms, this was meaningful, but not transformative. What made it significant was the fact that the modification appeared to be targeted specifically at the frequency range in which the AN/BQQ-5 sonar suite was most sensitive. At the National Security Agency's processing facility at Fort Meade, a signals intelligence analyst named Thomas Carey noticed this correlation in December 1980. He wrote a 3-page memo, classified secret/comment, noting that the acoustic modification to the Victor 3 appeared to be calibrated to the BQQ-5's published sensitivity curves. And he used the word published, but he appended a note. The sensitivity curves in question had never been published in any open source document he could identify. He recommended that the relevant classified technical specifications be reviewed to determine whether a compromise might have occurred. The memo was read by a deputy at the NSA's Soviet Military Signals Branch, noted as interesting but inconclusive, and filed. It would remain filed for 19 months. In those 19 months, Robert Hansen continued to pass material. The volume of his reporting to the GRU and, later, directly to the KGB's First Chief Directorate. The switch was made in 1985, and an operational adjustment that Hansen himself proposed and that Moscow accepted because the material he was providing was so valuable that bureaucratic friction was worth tolerating, cannot be fully quantified because some of the documents he passed were never recovered, and their compromise can only be inferred from subsequent Soviet behavior. But we know, from the criminal complaint filed by the FBI on February 20th, 2001, from the Justice Department's damage assessment completed in April 2002 and partially declassified in 2012 as DOJ-DAM-2002-004, and from interviews conducted by the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence in 2002, that Hansen passed material on U.S. nuclear war planning, on the identities of Soviet citizens recruited as CIA and FBI agents, at least 3 of whom were subsequently executed, and on the technical specifications of multiple classified defense programs. Among them, and the specifications he passed in 1979 through a dead drop in Nottoway Park on Courthouse Road in Vienna, Virginia, a location he had selected because he passed it on his morning run, included material that directly informed the Victor 3 modification. Kozlov, the man with the scuffed briefcase, was not the only channel. He was one node in a network. But the architectural elegance of what the KGB had constructed in Northern Virginia meant that the failure of any single node would not compromise the others. Kozlov could be arrested tomorrow, and Hansen would continue. Hansen could be arrested tomorrow, and Kozlov would continue. They did not know each other's names. They did not know each other existed. The system was not built on trust. It was built on the elimination of any requirement for trust. That the symbolic object that runs through this entire story, the thing that appears in every scene, that connects every player, is not the camera, not the cipher pad, not the blueprints. It is a photograph. Specifically, a single 3x5 black and white photograph that Kozlov carried in his wallet from the day he crossed the Canadian border in 1968 until the day he was arrested. A photograph of his mother standing in front of a building in Leningrad, never identified more specifically in any document, not by street name, not by district, wearing a dark coat with a white collar, squinting slightly against the sun. The photograph was not operational. It served no tradecraft purpose. Kozlov carried it because the psychology of long-term illegal work, the grinding, an unrelenting performance of a false self across years and decades, required some private anchor to the true self beneath. His case officer at Department S, Colonel Anatoly Primakov, had counseled against it during the pre-deployment training period in 1966 and 1967. Physical objects connected to real identity were operational liabilities. Kozlov had kept the photograph anyway. He had kept it in the innermost pocket of his wallet, behind the American Express card in the name of Alexei Kozlov, behind the Virginia driver's license, behind the George Mason University alumni card. Layers of fiction protecting one small truth. The FBI would photograph that wallet's contents when they arrested him. The photograph of the woman in the dark coat would appear in the evidence log as item 47-C. No one in the FBI would know who she was. No one in the CIA would know. She was the one thing about Yuri Kozlov, about the man behind Alexei Kozlov, but that the entire apparatus of American intelligence never decrypted. On October 11th, 1982, a counterintelligence officer at FBI Washington Field Office named Gerald Richards was reviewing the files of a separate, unrelated investigation into Soviet procurement activity for dual-use electronics when he encountered a reference that stopped him. A confidential informant within the Soviet commercial mission had reported, as a passing aside in a debriefing about purchasing patterns for computer components, that a colleague, not named, described only as a trade consultant, had recently received what the informant described as recognition from Moscow for a successful period of work. This was not an unusual thing for Soviet embassy employees to receive. It was the specific mechanism of recognition that Richards found interesting. The colleague had been permitted to send a letter via a channel outside the normal diplomatic pouch to a family member in the Soviet Union. Special permission to communicate outside official channels. Granted in the context of successful operational performance. Richards pulled every name he could find connected to the commercial mission and began running them against available files. He found Alexei Kozlov in the cross-referencing database 3 days later. He found the March 1979 parking garage surveillance log that Margaret Sherwood had filed in the Penrose working papers. He found that the Penrose investigation had been formally suspended in June 1980 for resource reasons. Its files boxed and transferred to inactive storage at a facility in Beltsville, Maryland. He requested the files. He read them over a weekend. On Monday morning, October 18, 1982, he wrote a 2-page request for a full investigation of Alexei Kozlov. It designated internally as Operation Graybird and submitted it to his supervisor. The supervisor approved it the same day. The clock started running again. The turning point did not come in the way that turning points are supposed to come, with a dramatic confrontation, a moment of illumination, a crisis that forced a choice. It came slowly, in the manner of most real intelligence breakthroughs, that through the accumulation of small observations that individually meant nothing and collectively meant everything. By the spring of 1983, the Graybird surveillance had established a pattern. Kozlov's movements were not random. They were rhythmically regular in ways that suggested operational structure. The same parking garages at irregular but patterned intervals. The same stretches of the same trails in the same Virginia parks. The same stop at the same payphone on Columbia Pike on the same approximate schedule. The pattern was consistent with dead drop activity, but consistent was not the same as proven. The FBI needed to observe an actual exchange. The problem was tradecraft. Kozlov's technique was essentially flawless. He employed what the FBI's counterintelligence training materials call a surveillance detection run, a series of movements, ostensibly purposeless, designed to identify any physical surveillance before proceeding to an operational act. His SDRs were long, sometimes 2 or 3 hours, and they incorporated natural behavioral cover, shopping, a meal, a visit to his children's school. A surveillance team following him long enough to observe an actual drop would almost certainly be detected. And if Kozlov detected surveillance, he would go dark, and the investigation would yield nothing. The solution came from an unexpected direction. In July 1983, the CIA's GTFOXH UNT source still active, now providing increasingly specific reporting, reported that a KGB illegal in the Washington area was experiencing what the source described in translated cable text as technical difficulties with document handling. The phrasing was vague, but the implication was that the illegal's camera equipment had malfunctioned. This was, from Graybird's perspective, a potentially exploitable moment of operational vulnerability. An asset experiencing equipment failure might need to vary his tradecraft, might need to establish emergency communication, might break from the patterns that had made him invisible. On August 3, 1983, Kozlov made a phone call, not from the Columbia Pike payphone, from a public telephone at a gas station on Lee Highway in Arlington. It was the first time in the entire Graybird surveillance that he had deviated from his established pattern of communication. The call lasted 47 seconds. The number he called was a payphone in Manhattan, at a location on West 86th Street, and the payphone had been identified in a separate FBI counterintelligence file, a file that Graybird's supervisor did not know existed, in a separate filing system, though accessible only to officers with a specific code word access designation, as a known KGB communication site. The call connected the two investigations, but it created a new problem. The Manhattan payphone was associated with a source protection protocol for a highly sensitive FBI asset. If Graybird pushed further in that direction, it risked exposing, or at least compromising the security envelope around, and something that the FBI's intelligence division considered more valuable than the Kozlov investigation itself. Gerald Richards learned this on August 9, 1983, in a meeting that lasted 12 minutes, with a supervisor he had never met before, in a conference room on the 4th floor of the J. Edgar Hoover building that he had never been to before, and was escorted out of afterward by a man who did not introduce himself. He was told that Graybird would continue, but that the line of investigation connected to the Manhattan number was off limits. No documentation of that meeting exists in the records that have been declassified. Richards described it in a 2005 interview published in David Wise's book on the Hansen case, in terms that suggest he understood immediately, in that conference room, that something was wrong, that the protected asset associated with the Manhattan payphone was not a source inside the KGB, that the protection that was running in the other direction. He did not act on this understanding. He could not act on it. He had no evidence. He had an instinct and a closed door. He went back to Alexandria, back to the surveillance of the quiet man with the scuffed briefcase, and he followed the trail he was permitted to follow. Kozlov was arrested on February 2nd, 1984. The arrest was the result of a different technique entirely. Not surveillance, not source reporting, but forensic document analysis. A classified Navy document that had appeared in a Soviet military journal in Moscow in late 1983, in a form that was clearly derivative of, translated from, though with enough technical modification to allow deniability, a U.S. Navy document that had been held at a very small number of classified storage facilities, one of which was the Soviet Commercial Missions Technical Library. The Technical Library had access to certain classified materials under a mutual exchange protocol established in 1972 under the Nixon-era detente agreements. Kozlov, as trade consultant, had signing authority for that library. The document trail led directly to him. The arrest was made by 4 FBI agents on a Tuesday morning on the parking lot of a Safeway on Duke Street, 2 blocks from the Landmark Mall parking garage, where, 5 years earlier, and the surveillance log had caught his Oldsmobile at midnight. He was wearing the brown corduroy jacket. He was carrying the briefcase. The briefcase, when opened in the FBI's evidence processing facility, contained the Minex camera, a half-exposed roll of Kodak film, and a one-time pad block. The aluminum false panel had been rebuilt after the earlier malfunctioning. The GTFOXHUNT report about technical difficulties had been accurate. In the innermost pocket of his wallet, behind the American Express card and the driver's license and the alumni card, was the photograph of the woman in the dark coat, squinting against the Leningrad sun. At the Soviet commercial mission, the news of Kozlov's arrest arrived by mid-morning. His colleagues, the genuine trade consultants, the clerks, the actual GRU officers under commercial cover, absorbed the information with the practiced neutrality of people who had been briefed, at some point in their careers, on how to react to exactly this situation. His desk was cleared, his files were transferred, his name was removed from the roster. By 3 p.m., the Soviet Foreign Ministry had issued a statement describing Kozlov as a genuine trade official who had been the victim of a provocative FBI harassment campaign, and demanding his release on the grounds that his commercial mission credentials gave him a degree of diplomatic protection, a claim that was legally dubious but would take weeks to resolve. It took 3 weeks. On February 23, 1984, in a negotiation conducted through back channels and documented in a State Department cable that remains partially redacted in its declassified form, Kozlov was exchanged for a CIA asset who had been held in Soviet custody since 1981. The exchange took place on the Glienicke Bridge in Berlin, the same bridge where Francis Gary Powers had been exchanged 23 years before. Kozlov walked east. The CIA asset walked west. The photograph of the woman in the dark coat was logged as evidence, transferred to inactive storage, and never returned. On Beauregard Street in Alexandria, the house at 4411 was listed for sale in March 1984. It sold in 6 weeks. The new owners were a young couple, recently married, who worked in technology. They planted new flowers in the front garden. They did not know, and had no way of knowing, what conversations had been conducted in the kitchen, but what documents had been photographed in the study, what the previous occupant had been. The mailbox was repainted. The name on it now was different. The house was, once again, simply a house. The truth, as much of it as is available, came out in stages. It always does in these cases. The first stage was the smallest. Kozlov's arrest generated a brief paragraph in the Washington Post on February 3, 1984, describing the arrest of a Soviet commercial mission employee on espionage charges. And the name used was Alexei Kozlov. The story ran on page A12. It was not followed up. The second stage came in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed and the KGB's archives became, briefly, partially accessible to a small number of Western intelligence historians and former officers under programs that have never been fully documented. A researcher working under a CIA contract, the contract's terms classified, and the researcher's name not publicly identified in any document I have been able to locate, produced a report in late 1992, classified secret and designated CIHQ-HT-1992-000018, which identified Kozlov's true name as Yuri Alexandrovich Nosenko, the same last name as the famous 1964 defector, confirming the suspicion that the duplication had been deliberate, and reconstructed from KGB files the basic architecture of his operational activity in the United States between 1968 and 1984. The report noted that Kozlov's most productive period had been 1978 to 1980. It listed, in general terms, the categories of intelligence he had passed. Naval technical specifications appeared on the list. The report made no connection to Hansen, because in 1992, the Hansen investigation did not exist. The FBI did not open a formal investigation of Robert Hansen until 2000, triggered by the purchase, from a Russian source, out of an old KGB file that contained a fingerprint in a plastic bag used in a dead drop. Evidence so concrete that even the Bureau's institutional reluctance to believe it had a mole at its senior level could not explain it away. Hansen was arrested on February 18, 2001, at Foxstone Park in Vienna, Virginia, in the act of leaving a package at a dead drop site. The package contained $7,000 in cash and a note to his handlers. He had been under surveillance for 3 months by a team that included CIA officers, a departure from standard protocol that reflected the Bureau's recognition that this was not an ordinary case. At his arrest, he said, "What took you so long?" It is the most frequently quoted line from the Hansen case. It has been interpreted as arrogance, as black humor, as the statement of a man who had known, for 22 years, that he was better at this than the people looking for him. Now, it may also have been a genuine question. Hansen was a counterintelligence professional. He understood the craft. He had watched from inside the FBI as investigation after investigation probed the edges of what he was doing, and each time came up short or was redirected. He had lived for 2 decades with the knowledge that someone else, someone in Alexandria, in a house he had never visited, with a wallet he had never seen, was running a parallel operation in the same city, passing material through the same architecture of dead drops and one-time pads. He had never known Kozlov's name, but he had, at some point, known that there was someone. In the FBI's damage assessment, finalized in April 2002, the intersection of the Hansen operation and the Kozlov operation in the period 1978 to 1984 is addressed in a section that remains classified in its entirety. What is visible in the released version is a single redacted paragraph under the heading, Redundant Collection, Naval Technical Intelligence, and the notation that the compound effect of redacted operational activity during this period significantly accelerated the Soviet Navy's capability development timeline in a manner that the naval intelligence community did not assess until redacted. Gerald Richards, who had sat in that conference room on the 4th floor of the Hoover Building in August 1983 and understood, though in some inarticulate way, that the protected asset on the other end of the Manhattan payphone was not what he had been told it was. Richards retired from the FBI in 1996, 5 years before Hansen's arrest. He gave one interview to Wise for the 2002 book and said very little that was not already public. What he said at the end of that interview was this: "There was a point where I thought I could see the whole picture, but I was only seeing the frame." He died in 2009. He was 62 years old. Margaret Sherwood, the CIA officer who had filed the parking garage surveillance log in the Penrose working papers in April 1979 and had not acted on it, rose through the Directorate of Operations and retired as a senior officer in 1998. In a 2004 memoir, she wrote about the Penrose investigation in a single paragraph, noting its suspension in 1980 and expressing the view, in careful, hedged language, that the decision to suspend it had been premature. She did not name Hansen. The memoir's publisher was a small imprint connected to former intelligence community professionals. The paragraph about Penrose was not reviewed in any major publication. Kozlov, Yuri Nosenko, returned to Moscow in February 1984 and, according to the 1992 CYA historical report, was assigned to an administrative role within Department S. The assignment was a form of professional quarantine, an illegal who had been arrested, even if exchanged rather than tried, and was considered operationally compromised, and was not redeployed in the field. He received a departmental commendation, a certificate, and a reduced operational assignment. His wife Natalia remained in Moscow. His children, Elena and Dmitry, who had grown up in Virginia and who spoke English without accent and Russian with one, were sent to school in Moscow. Elena would later study international economics at Moscow State University. Dmitry would later emigrate to Germany. Neither of them appears in any intelligence document after 1990. The woman in the photograph, the woman in the dark coat, squinting against the Leningrad sun, was identified in a footnote in the 1992 CPRS, a historical report, as Kozlov's mother, Alexandra Nosenko, née Ryabova. She had died in Leningrad in 1977. Kozlov had been carrying the photograph for 7 years after her death before he was arrested. He had been carrying it through every dead drop, every surveillance detection run, every midnight parking garage visit, through the aluminum false panel and the Minix camera and the flash paper cipher, as the one private thing in an entirely constructed life. The evidence log listing it as Item 47-C is publicly available through a FOIA request filed in 2008 by a graduate researcher at the University of Virginia. The photograph itself is in the National Archives, in a sealed evidence box, in a climate-controlled storage facility in College Park, Maryland. It has not been displayed, reproduced, or otherwise presented publicly. The box containing it has a yellow restricted access label. The label lists no review date. What the Kozlov operation changed in the immediate aftermath of the 1984 arrest was specific and measurable. The FBI's Counterintelligence Division established a new protocol for cross-referencing embassy-affiliated personnel files with surveillance logs from all field offices, a process that had previously required manual request and was notoriously slow. The new system, called the Liaison Matrix by its designers and described in an unclassified FBI management report from 1986, reduced the average cross-referencing time from weeks to hours. The Naval Intelligence Community. Once the damage assessment confirmed that BQQ5 specifications had been compromised, initiated an accelerated development program for the ANBQQ6, a successor system that incorporated acoustic processing improvements designed to maintain the detection advantage that the Victor III modifications had partially eroded. The program, classified at the time, was partially described in a 1993 congressional budget document. The cost was significant. The delay to the Soviet Navy's ability to close the acoustic gap was, according to the DIA's 1985 assessment, approximately 4 years, meaning the compromise had shortened the American advantage by roughly that amount. The policy consequence of longer duration was different and harder to quantify. The Kozlov case, along with the Pelton case in 1985, the Walker spy ring prosecuted the same year, and a series of other espionage investigations through the mid-1980s, contributed to the intelligence community's growing recognition that the illegal program posed a threat qualitatively different from the diplomatic espionage threat. The result was a classified counterintelligence strategic review, initiated in 1986 and completed in 1988, that for the first time allocated dedicated analytical resources specifically to the detection of illegals operating outside the embassy structure. But the program, designated Operation Nightjar in internal documents, generated significant internal friction. It required a degree of domestic surveillance activity that existing legal authorities made difficult, and its operational proposals repeatedly ran into the jurisdictional boundaries between the CIA's Foreign Intelligence Mandate and the FBI's Domestic Counterintelligence Authority. Nightjar identified several suspected illegals between 1988 and 2001, and its most significant discovery, the one that produced the most damaging evidentiary product, was, ironically, not an illegal at all. It was Robert Hansen. The connection is indirect, but real. One of Nightjar's analytical products was a study of communication patterns within the Soviet intelligence community that identified anomalous dead drop activity in Northern Virginia, the same activity that Hansen had been conducting, with gradually evolving methodology, since 1979. The study was completed in 1993 and shared with the FBI's Intelligence Division. The FBI did not act on it. The reasons for this inaction are disputed. The 2001 Senate investigation concluded that institutional rivalry between the CIA and FBI, combined with the FBI's institutional resistance to the idea that one of its own senior officers could be a spy, had created a collective blindness. The 2002 damage assessment used more measured language, and noting that the analytical product had been insufficiently specific to generate a predicated investigation under then applicable guidelines. What changed in 2000 was not better analysis. It was money. The CIA paid $7 million for the KGB file containing Hansen's fingerprint and the dead drop bag. The price, when it became public in a 2003 investigative report, generated congressional hearings. The hearings generated nothing of legislative consequence. Again, the $7 million generated an arrest. For the neighbors on Beauregard Street, the people who had watched the quiet man wave from the driveway, who had found paper bags of tomatoes on their doorsteps, The Kozlov story ended with a news brief on page A12 and a for sale sign. None of them gave interviews, or if they did, none were reported. And this is consistent with what researchers who study the social psychology of exposure to embedded intelligence operatives have consistently found. The people closest to the deception are, typically, the least willing to engage with its meaning. The cognitive work required to reframe 11 years of neighborly interaction as performance, as tactical relationship management, by a foreign intelligence officer running espionage operations against the country they lived in, is, apparently, a work that most people decline to do. Elena Kozlov, Elena Nosenko, after her return to Moscow, published a short memoir in Russian in 2011, covering her childhood in Virginia without identifying where the family had lived or what her father had done. The memoir was not translated into English. A brief review in a Russian literary magazine described it as a meditation on the strangeness of belonging to two countries simultaneously, and to neither completely. The reviewer found it melancholy. The reviewer found it honest. There is a room in the National Archives facility in College Park, Maryland, Building 2, East Wing, climate-controlled storage area designated CR7, where the evidence boxes from the Kozlov prosecution sit on metal shelving in numbered order, item 1A through item 83F. The room is 64 degrees Fahrenheit. The humidity is held at 45%. Fluorescent lights come on automatically when someone enters and go off 30 seconds after they leave. Item 47C is a 3x5 black and white photograph in a polyethylene sleeve. If you could hold it, and you cannot, without the appropriate archival access credentials, without a documented research purpose, without a letter from a supervisor, and a form filed 14 days in advance, you would see a woman standing in front of a building, wearing a dark coat with a white collar, squinting slightly against the sun. The building behind her is not identified. The sun is coming from her right, which suggests the photograph was taken in the afternoon. She is not looking directly at the camera. She is looking slightly past it, at something outside the frame. She does not know that the photograph will cross an ocean and live for 16 years in the inner pocket of a wallet behind an American Express card in a false name. She does not know that it will be the only true object in an entirely false life. She does not know that it will be itemized by a federal evidence technician as item 47C and placed in a polyethylene sleeve in a climate-controlled room where the lights go off 30 seconds after the last person leaves. She is just a woman in a dark coat in the afternoon sun, looking at something outside the frame. The frame is everything we have access to. Beyond it, the picture is sealed. In the intelligence files of the Soviet Union, in the archive of the SVR, the Foreign Intelligence Service that succeeded the KGB's first chief directorate after 1991, there is almost certainly a parallel record of this same story, told from the other direction, with different names emphasized and different decisions vindicated. Those files have not been released. They may never be released. They sit in a building in Yasenevo, on the southwestern edge of Moscow, in rooms that are also climate controlled, where the temperature is also steady and the humidity is also managed, and where the lights may or may not go off when the last person leaves. Somewhere in those files, if the archivists are thorough, and the KGB's archivists were always thorough, there is a photograph of a street in Alexandria, Virginia. A quiet street. A sand beige Oldsmobile in a driveway. A brown corduroy jacket. A man who waved. The file is probably still active. In the intelligence world, certain files are never closed, and they are suspended and deferred, transferred to new handlers under new administrative designations. The operation ends. The file does not. The only question that cannot be answered from either side by any declassified document or any congressional testimony or any $7 million purchase from any archive. What was she looking at in the photograph beyond the frame? That question has no classification level. It has no document number. It belongs entirely and to the sealed space between what intelligence services know and what the rest of us are permitted to ask.